This is Sensor Studio, questioning logic. Saudi Arabia will host the 2029 Winter Asian Games. Not the summer, but the Winter Games. Did you hear that? It sounds strange. Recently, it appears Saudi Arabia may not host the Winter Asian Games, so they're seeking another host. Today, let's take a closer look at this. Let's get right into it. Saudi Arabia has come right out and said it. They said hosting the 2029 Winter Asian Games might be difficult. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia asked if Korea could host the Winter Asian Games instead. Yoo Sung-min, president of the Korean Sports and Olympic Committee, said he couldn't decide immediately and would consult the government after being asked about hosting the 2029 Winter Asian Games. He then reported this to Korea's Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism is re-evaluating the synergy of hosting the 2029 Winter Asian Games and deciding whether to host it. Actually, just hearing this might not seem strange, but let's take a closer look. Saudi Arabia is a region where it hardly ever snows in winter. Among Asian countries, there aren't many where it actually snows, so up until now, the only countries that have hosted the Winter Asian Games have been Korea, China, Japan, and Kazakhstan. As you know, Saudi Arabia rarely gets snow. With 95% of the country being desert, how could they host the Winter Asian Games? Anyway, that's just common sense. In October 2022, Saudi Arabia was unanimously chosen to host the 2029 Winter Asian Games at the Asian Olympic Council's general meeting. Saudi Arabia announced plans to build venues with artificial snow for the Winter Asian Games. As a result, Saudi Arabia started building facilities alongside the well-known Neom City project. Neom City is a major project in Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 decarbonization plan, announced in 2017 by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This is the Trojena project. Saudi Arabia has publicly declared both domestically and internationally that it will develop the Trojena region, the center of the Trojena project, into a world-class winter sports hub. Plans included building ski slopes, stadiums, hotels, resorts, and golf courses here. Even with all its wealth, Saudi Arabia still faces clear limits. The Financial Times reports that to make artificial snow and supply water to the resorts, water is transported 200 kilometers from the sea. With no rivers or lakes nearby, they must bring in seawater. Construction on the key seawater desalination plant hasn't begun yet. Above all, the Trojena area is a highland region at an altitude of 2,600 meters, so they're having a hard time transporting materials. Even with significant funds, Saudi Arabia reportedly needs $19 billion to build Trojena. That's about 26.43 trillion won. The problem is, costs are skyrocketing. With falling oil prices and a budget deficit, it's hard for them to raise money. Saudi Arabia says the Trojena project is progressing smoothly as planned. However, there are concerns it won't be finished before the 2029 Winter Asian Games. That's why Saudi Arabia is searching for other places to host the 2029 Winter Asian Games. Of course, Saudi Arabia hasn't officially announced that they will give up hosting the 2029 Winter Asian Games yet. Seeing that related sports officials are contacting Korea, it seems they've really run out of options. So it seems that Saudi Arabia is considering scaling down the Trojena project. Saudi Arabia, with 95% desert land, is spending heavily to host various international events, but in a place where it hardly ever snows. Saudi Arabia's bid to host the Winter Asian Games, despite little snowfall, faces criticism for alleged sports washing by the Saudi royal family. Sports washing is when a country, company, or group uses sports to hide issues and improve their image. Saudi Arabia is suspected of using sports to distract from domestic human rights issues and crimes like journalist murders. In fact, not only will they host the 2029 Winter Asian Games, but also the 2034 FIFA World Cup and the Summer Asian Games. All of this is basically to create bigger issues in order to downplay the various human rights problems happening within Saudi Arabia. This time, they faced a major issue by trying to host the Winter Asian Games somewhere without snow. Saudi Arabia is looking at South Korea or China as options for the 2019 Winter Asian Games. According to a report by the Financial Times, there have been internal discussions about having South Korea or China host the 2029 Games instead, and then Saudi Arabia would host the next Games in 2033. South Korea and China, having recently hosted the Winter Olympics and possessing the required facilities and expertise, are seen as strong alternatives. Of course, the governments of South Korea and China have stated that they have never had any discussions with Saudi Arabia regarding this matter, but it seems that Saudi Arabia is considering giving up on hosting the 2029 Winter Asian Games altogether. The The recent situation shows why Saudi Arabia faces major obstacles despite its wealth. First of all, it's safe to say that Saudi Arabia is a country built on oil money. It's a country heavily reliant on oil, which makes up 40% of its gross domestic product and 75% of government finances per 2022 International Monetary Fund data. International oil prices became volatile. After the Ukraine war began in 2022, prices soared and Saudi Arabia profited greatly. Oil prices recently fell below $60 per barrel, their lowest in 4 years. As oil prices fell, Saudi Arabia also faced significant losses. Currently, Saudi Arabia needs oil at $90 per barrel to balance its budget, but there's a $30 gap. Falling oil prices caused Saudi Arabia to post a $22 trillion fiscal deficit in this year's first quarter. If oil prices fall further, Saudi Arabia's deficit will worsen and become more troubling. Goldman Sachs predicts that if oil prices drop further, Saudi Arabia's fiscal deficit could hit $75 billion or 104 trillion won this year. Of course, since Saudi Arabia has prepared plenty of foreign reserves for this, the country's economy won't be seriously affected or anything like that. They won't be able to spend freely as before and likely won't host events like the Asian Games now. Their fiscal deficit is too severe. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia is leading efforts to lower oil prices. In the last 3 years, Saudi Arabia has cut oil production, extracting less oil. But recently, they abruptly abandoned everything and boosted oil production. On the surface, the reason is that they're trying to discipline countries in Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus that don't want to follow Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus's control. Currently, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus's 23 member countries have kept production cuts to maintain high oil prices. Kazakhstan and Iraq have been boosting oil production by developing new fields to maximize their national interests. From the perspective of Saudi Arabia, this probably wasn't very welcome. Saudi Arabia raised production to intentionally lower global oil prices and enforce discipline within Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus. Similar cases have happened before, so it looks like they're trying to keep discipline in the group. But the problem is that Saudi Arabia's budget deficit is getting bigger and bigger, and now it seems they might not even be able to host the 2029 Winter Asian Games. So they're desperately looking for a new host. In that case, from Korea's perspective, is there really a need to take on this event? Objectively, there's no real reason we have to do it. Korea has hosted the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and other international events, and has ample winter sports infrastructure. In other words, even if Korea hosts another Winter Asian Games right now, it won't significantly boost the country's brand image, nor is Korea in a desperate situation where it needs to completely revamp its image. In the short term, there will be a clear burden. Hosting the event requires mobilizing administrative resources and extensive preparations, including stadium operations, athlete village management, and handling transport and lodging. Of course, it is said that existing infrastructure can be used, but the fact remains that a significant amount of tax money will inevitably be spent. From the public's perspective, it's understandable that people would question why we have to do something that Saudi Arabia couldn't, and complaints about this are bound to arise. Therefore, if Korea accepts Saudi Arabia's request and hosts the 2029 East Asian Games instead, we shouldn't approach it with the mindset that we should do it just because we're capable. Instead, we should make hosting conditional to ensure clear compensation and benefits from Saudi Arabia. For example, there should be tangible benefits, such as Saudi Arabia covering a significant portion of the hosting costs, or Korean companies securing priority rights to participate in the construction of the Neom City Trojena project. If that happens, Korea could bear all the costs and just play a supporting role for Saudi Arabia, wasting taxpayer money with no benefit. In short, Korea should view this solely from a national interest standpoint, unless there are conditions that can bring tangible benefits. Rather than just the abstract justification of strengthening our status as the center of Asian sports, there is absolutely no need for us to host this event again. On the contrary, if Korea can use this as leverage to secure economic and diplomatic advantages in negotiations with Saudi Arabia, then it becomes an option worth considering. Saudi Arabia is seeking a venue to host the 2019 Winter Asian Games. I also hope that this will lead to something beneficial for Korea's national interests. What do you all think about Saudi Arabia's actions? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. That's the end of the video. Thank you.